The next chapter is a very broad and very important topic, and that is communication, how people within an organization communicate with each other. So, of course, whenever you have communication, you have a receiver and you have a sender. There could be an encoding of the message, could be as simple as an email, could be something that is a little bit more sophisticated. The message has to be received and the message has to be decoded. Now, again, this doesn't mean just decoding literally. It could also mean reading between the lines. Sometimes when somebody wants to complain about somebody else to a supervisor, they don't complain outright, but they make a statement that should be interpreted as leveling some sort of a complaint. So, that's the sort of thing that a boss might have to read between the lines, or somebody in the company might have to read between the lines when it comes to looking at what somebody reported. There are formal channels and there are informal channels of communication. Formal channels means going along the authority chain, going to your supervisor or going to that person's supervisor. And this should be, of course, used for things that are strictly related to professional activities. Then there are informal channels of communication, which is based on personal communication, social communication, informal conversations, that sort of thing. And of course, there's upward communication. There's downward communication. Downward communication is the people on the lower end of the totem pole, the lower part of the totem pole from you, and then there's communication to the supervisor. Again, these are all pretty self-explanatory concepts. Communication that's downward is to somebody who is your subordinate. You may explain what the decision is. You don't and you can explain why the decision is that. Generally speaking, supervisors don't ask for permission. Sometimes, I mean, it says over here that they don't solicit advice. I don't know if that's necessarily always true. A supervisor can solicit advice from an employee. It's not necessarily always such a bad idea, but the supervisor is the person who is tasked with the ultimate decision making. There's upward communication, which means communication to a higher level, a supervisor, to keep managers aware how employees feel about their job and their organization, and also suggestions for how things can improve. And then you've got lateral communication, which means communication between members who are on equal level of the organization. Of course, this helps facilitate everybody being on the same page. It helps save time rather than going through the formal channels. If I want to say something about somebody else's performance or discuss somebody else's performance with that person, channels might be going to my supervisor, who then goes to that person's supervisor, who then goes to that person. Or, in many cases, and especially in an informal way, I might go to that person directly and skip the chain over here. So next we continue with methods of communication. You have the chain of communication, which sometimes is considered the ideal for big companies and companies that want to keep everything in the proper order, where you have people that communicate with their supervisors and that supervisor with that supervisor, and they just go up the line all the way to the CEO, I guess, theoretically. You've got the wheel, where you have multiple people that communicate with one central individual. That person's usually a supervisor or maybe an HR person, somebody whose responsibility is to coordinate communication between several different people and in several different contexts. Then you've got all channel communication, which everybody communicates with everybody else. None of these are necessarily right or wrong. It's just a question of being more or less effective in certain contexts. Chain communication, of course, decreases creativity and discourages people from communicating that much because you don't have a lot to communicate with. But on the other hand, it saves time, and all channel communications could just cause a lot of confusion when people are getting advice and discussion and feedback from so many different sources that are not coordinated. So, for example, chain communication, the speed is moderate, but inaccuracy is high. Problem is but network wheels, when people can communicate with the same central person, happens quickly. But the thing is, the satisfaction isn't that high because people don't get to communicate each other. They all just have to communicate with just one central individual. All channel is high member satisfaction, but on the other hand, you don't really have a leader that emerges because everybody's communicating with each other and without any particular central authority moderating that. And the accuracy can suffer a little bit when you're talking about all channel, again, because people don't get to put the communications in context. Where if you're dealing with a network wheel, one person can kind of filter everything and that's being brought to their attention and combine it with whatever contexts. You have one person that really knows all this information, so this person can really determine what's relevant and what's not based on seeing the big picture. The chain. The idea of the chain is the person on top would see the big picture, and the idea of the network wheel is that one person will get all the information, so this person will really be an expert on seeing the big picture. Communication in an organization through the quote unquote grapevine could cause problems. It could cause a lot of inaccuracies, rumors to fly back and forth, communication between people with little power to actually do anything about it. And this is very common both in the context of work but also in the context of general life. The grapevine being an informal communication that's based on word of mouth. It exists when the situation is important, so people gossip about it. Ambiguity exists because people don't know exactly what's going on, so they kind of spread rumors and discuss rumors, analyze the situation, and it causes anxiety because people don't really fully understand what's going on if they're just hearing everything secondhand and through rumors and through the quote unquote grapevine. So that's one thing that in normal social circles it's pretty much second nature. It's going to happen. But when you're talking about work environments, you want to try to avoid this method of communication. You want to try to for people to understand and be clear. So that's the idea of what types of communication there are. Now we're going to discuss modes of communication. In other words, how can you actually communicate? It can be oral, which means word of mouth. It can be written, or it could be nonverbal, which is not well, written is, I guess, a form of nonverbal communication, but things like nodding of a head, winking, rolling your eyes, like I think I communicated that the idea that I just heard was that I can convey I'm contemptuous of the idea I just heard simply by rolling my eyes. Okay, oral communication, which means communication by speaking. The advantage is, of course, it happens right away. You don't have to wait and communicate your ideas in writing, which could take longer. You get instant feedback. You can see how people take it. They can respond to you immediately, and it's simple to correct. You make a mistake when you speak, you can just unsay it very quickly, especially if it's not taped. You can quickly correct yourself. Disadvantage is the grapevine issue, the gossip issue, the potential for distorted message when passed through a number of people. This is the famous Norman Rockwell painting on gossip, on the idea how ideas spread from person to person, where one person tells the first person, and each time it gets repeated to the point where something very very distorted at the end comes up, and of course this is the person who originally started the rumor, and by the time it finished, the idea of the what originally happened is no longer really represented in what the story is being told. The story that's being told kind of takes on a life of its own, which is a major disadvantage of oral communication. Written communication, on the other hand, of course, is the longest lasting form of communication, but it also has its problems in that it's harder to correct because you'd have to, let's say, send another email or another memo to correct the first one. People might not see the second one; they might just see the first one. And and also, of course, it takes longer to write. You don't get the feedback isn't instant, but of course, you can think about your words much more carefully. I mean, personally, I like written communication in an organizational structure more than oral communication because there's less of a chance that it's going to be misconstrued. You think about your words more when you say them. Sometimes I'll even write an email, especially if it's on a complex or sensitive subject. I'll write an email and then I'll wait overnight and look at it the next morning and see if I still feel the same way. And believe me, hundreds of times I've come back the next morning in that kind of a situation and I've read it over, thought about it, and then pressed the delete button because it might have seemed like a good idea to say it at 7 o'clock last night, but at 9:15 after a good night's sleep and after being a little more cool-headed, it may not be such a good idea to send it after all. That's an advantage of written communication rather than calling up right away and yelling. You can try written communication and send it when you're really sure that you want to send it. And the third type of communication is nonverbal communication. Now, written communication, as I said before, is really a type of nonverbal communication, but so this is really more accurate to say would be nonverbal and non-written communication. Body language. Body language could be the I mean, you know what body language is. It could be the facial expression, it could be the intonation, how you put the emphasis on which syllable. Do you say it in a sarcastic way? Do you say it in a facetious way? Do you say it in a fun way? Do you say it in a serious way? Are your eyes downcast? Your physical distance, how far away do you stay from the person? Do you walk up to the person directly? It's like a more intimate tone. Do you stay 12 feet away from the person? It almost seems like you have that you can address all sorts of nonverbal cues by these ways in which you establish your communication. Now, different type of communication channels have different levels of channel richness, which means the ability to get across many different factors. If you're just writing a memo or a letter, which is all the way over here toward the low channel richness scale, here you're talking about things where you just don't convey a lot beyond the words themselves. I mean, even lower than that is a formal report, where you're even more rigid and more formal and less, reading between the lines. Everything is very generic, and everything is very cold, so to speak. As you get further along, you're able to communicate more and more ideas other than just through the words themselves. Pre-recorded speeches are, pretty cold still, but at least you do have some eye contact. You do have some, ability of the person to be able to read your face, etc. As you go further and further in this way, you get more nonverbal communications and more richness and more ability to increase the effectiveness of the communication to where you get face-to-face conversation. You have all of these nonverbal cues in terms of speaking speed and distance from the person and head movement and intonation in the voice. And as you move along, the method of communication gets richer and richer. So it's one of the things you have to realize when you do send an email, which again I do prefer, generally speaking, especially on a complex topic, to face-to-face. But you have to realize that people might misconstrue what is said just because of the fact that it's hard to convey sarcasm. It's much harder to convey sarcasm or facetiousness or playfulness when you're writing than it is when you're speaking. I think we've all experienced cases in which we've texted or emailed someone and we were being sarcastic and the person just didn't realize that. So choosing a communication method becomes of paramount importance because of this. So a variety of methods may be needed to convey important ideas. It says here to decide between oral and written communication, but you can do both. You can send an email and then follow it up with a telephone call and then follow it up with an in-person meeting. Sometimes you can't have an in-person meeting, so you can have a web conference. Sometimes you can't even have a web conference, so you have a telephone conference. And depending, sometimes you don't want the communication to be that rich. If you have a very formal statement you need to make to somebody, maybe you'd prefer to be cold and distant and not convey your true feelings. Sometimes if you need to bluff someone, it's better to email because it's harder to bluff when you're looking at the person, or when you're looking at or even when you're speaking on the phone than when you're writing something. When you're writing something, you could consider each word carefully and figure out how it's going to look to the other person, whereas you can't really do that when you're looking at somebody and you're talking to them face to face. And let's look at some of the features and drawbacks of both of these types of communication, oral and written. Now, of course, we're not really going to look at the context of nonverbal communication, because nonverbal communication, like intonation, and that's something that you choose with oral or with written communication. An emoticon would be an example of nonverbal communication in writing. When you at the end of your sentence, you put something like this. You put a smiley face, which means you're joking around, or you put a sad face, means you're disappointed or sad or angry or whatever it is. So I mean, these are things that you have to look out for, and you can do it when you're oral. You can establish your voice or your eye contact and figure out a way to work it into your communication. Or writing, you can do it as well. Oral communication, of course, is best when gauging the receiver's receptivity is important. You want to see the other person's eyes as you give your idea. Is the other person skeptical? Is the other person excited? Is the other person enthusiastic? Does the other person dread the idea? But consider the receiver's preference And many other things as well. Does the person want to be in a situation where they kind of give away their interest, or will they intentionally try to use a poker face in order to prevent anybody else from gauging their interest in something? The pace of your work environment, is it the sort of thing that there are timing aspects that go into this. Writing can take longer, but on the other hand, written communication very often you only have to do once, whereas in oral communication you might have to go through several conversations before you adequately convey the idea. Your speaking ability, don't overestimate your own ability to convey something. If something is difficult to explain or difficult to understand, you may want to consider writing it just to ensure more clarity on your part. Written communication has a lot of other advantages. It provides a tangible and verifiable record. Now you can prove to the person that you communicated to and to other people that you actually sent this communication. If you're a lawyer, for example, you want to very often say things to your clients by email rather than by phone, because if your client doesn't take your advice and then later on blames you, well, you have a record that you gave the client the advice, and if the client didn't want to listen, well, then that's the client's problem. Message is physically available for later reference. You can look over what you said, and the other person can look over what you wrote as well. Whereas oral communication, as soon as it's spoken, it dies, and it exists in people's memory, and people's memory can be faulty. Messages are likely to be well thought out, logical, and clear if they're written, because again, you don't have to make the decision to send until you've read through your email 5 or 6 times and maybe made some edits. Grammar mistakes and, in general, sloppy writing, of course, can be problematic. It can make people have less respect for your communication in general. So it's the sort of thing where if you're going to write an email, that's fine, but just make sure it's well written. If it's not well written, the person's not going to have as much respect. Then, if it's not going to be well written, you might as well do it orally. Now, there are whole courses in persuasive communication, things like public speaking courses, but we'll just briefly cover a little bit of a survey of some of the concepts regarding persuasive communication. People process information and make decisions in terms of whether they believe something or whether they're convinced by something on a few different levels. And they include automatic processing, which is superficial consideration. Very often you make an argument to somebody and they'll decide almost immediately whether they believe you or not. Now, that can be subject to change later on, but you want to be effective in the short term as well as in the long term. It takes little time and minimal effort to watch somebody communicating or read somebody's communication and make a decision about whether you believe it. It's not as reliable in the long term, because the long term decision making in this area is called controlled processing, which is detailed consideration of evidence, facts, figures, logic. The advantage of that as a reader is that it requires a lot of effort and energy. That's a disadvantage, but you're much likely to make an informed decision. When you are communicating with somebody, try to make sure you hit both levels. Try to make sure that your argument has superficial appeal and that you're able to make it in a convincing manner to begin with, but also make sure that your argument is backed up by facts and figures and logic, so that if the person does think about it more and go to this controlled processing level, they'll still be convinced. So, I mean, the choice about which one you focus more on depends on the interest level of the listener, the prior knowledge of the listener. If a person already is very detailed, not has detailed knowledge of the area, they're more likely to think about things more deeply and to require evidence to change their mind. The personality. Sometimes people are just very quick to make decisions, and in that case, you might want to appeal to the person's short-term decision-making faculties rather than the person's long-term. And the characteristics of the message. Is it something it's very important, or is it something quick? Do you want somebody to decide where to go to lunch? You might have a very you're probably going to make the decision very, very quickly. So the automatic processing might be, if you're convincing somebody where to go to lunch, you probably don't have to say, 62% of Zagat's respondents said that this was superior to the other restaurant that we're considering. It's just not that significant. You can say, they've got burgers, and burgers are good, and that may be all you really need to say. Then there's the idea of barriers to effective communication. In other words, what is it that causes people to fail at communication? Well, there are many different ideas, obviously, but here are some examples. There's filtering, the idea that people don't uh, accept all information. It eliminates or removes redundant information, unwanted information, information that the listener doesn't feel that he or she needs. So you have to realize that if you repeat yourself a lot, people are going to stop listening to you. Selective perception. How do people interpret the information that you're saying? Is it based on their own perception? If they perceive something to be a good idea and you give information that it's a good idea, that's going to be listened to more carefully. Whereas if you give information that it's a bad idea, people might listen to it less carefully. Information overload. You give people too much information, they might just stop listening. They might shut down and make the decision already based on what little information they do because they don't want to have to process all that additional information. Emotions. Are people upset? Are people happy? How they filter your information is going to be through that prism as well. Your language. Again, it could be a language in terms of like English or Spanish, or it could be the words that you use and the way in which you use them. Silence. Not saying anything. People just keeping their thoughts inside and not putting things out there for feedback is obviously a barrier to communication. Communication apprehension. Some people are a little afraid of communicating. They're afraid they're going to be embarrassed by saying the wrong thing. They're afraid they're going to mess things up, so they keep quiet in the first place. And then, of course, lying is obviously also a barrier to effective communication because there might be communication, but the communication is misleading and causes people to make mistakes because the information is wrong. Global implications is based on the idea that people from different countries, different languages, different ethnicities, different cultures are likely to maybe interpret subtle things a little bit differently. Handshaking might mean one thing in one culture and one thing in another country, another culture. Bowing in Japanese culture means something a lot different than bowing in American culture. Things like semantics, how you emphasize things, the connotations of different words, which even in two people that speak the same language might mean very different things based on the cultural background. Even within the United States, for example, people in the South and people in the North may look at the same word very differently. Tone differences, perception differences, these are all things that are barriers to communication between people of different cultures. If they're between very different cultures, a Chinese person and an American person, the global implications are very strong. Whereas one person's from New York and one person's from Pennsylvania, there might be a slight difference, but not as great. So there are certain ways to kind of avoid these problems, to know yourself, understand which culture you're from, foster a climate of respect, fairness, and democracy, and try to explain. And in that way, if you say something that has a different context and a different culture, people might give you the benefit of the doubt and ascribe it to a cultural difference rather than thinking something bad about you. Try to learn the cultural context of each person. If you're dealing with somebody from India, well, try to learn about the communication culture in India so that you can be a little bit more effective in communication. If you're not sure, listen rather than talk. It's always a way to get a better perception of the other person. State the facts, not your interpretation of the facts, because interpretations can vary greatly from culture to culture. Facts don't vary that greatly. Consider the other person's point of view and maintain the identity of the group rather than focusing specifically on the individual. These are all very general, but these are some guides, some general ideas that might help with communication. Okay, so let's take a look at some implications for managers, from the entire chapter. Uh, Communication mode will determine your effectiveness: oral, written, subtle cues, sarcasm, emoticons, whatever you put in. Think about all the different methods that you're communicating something. They're all going to have an impact. Trying to obtain feedback is a great idea in general because if you can obtain feedback, you can then know. If you foster a communication environment where people are free to give feedback and you say something that is misinterpreted, well then if people give you the feedback, you'll know that it's misinterpreted and you can correct yourself. But on the other hand, if you foster an environment where people are afraid to give feedback, you may never know that you gave the wrong impression. Remember that written communication creates more misunderstandings than oral communication because you can't use tone, eye contact, body language. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing this with the video, with the webcam. Many videos I've done have been just oral, because I'm hoping that you can pick up some extra signals from my eye contact and from from the way my face moves as I'm saying various things. Now, of course, I'm going to be very conscious about it since I mentioned it. But that's one of the things that that oral communication and when you see the communicator can help with. Make sure you use communication strategies that are appropriate to your audience, and of course, keep in mind communication barriers barriers: culture, gender, race, whatever it is. Okay, and these are just kind of reiterations of what we've just discussed, and I will see you in the next chapter.